Hey guys, tonight we're doing something that might leave you shivering under your blankets. You've survived modern winters with central heating and electric blankets, so yeah, you probably won't survive this either. But let's pretend it's January 1348 and London is about to teach you what cold really means. Before you get too comfortable, dim the lights, maybe grab that extra blanket, and let's step into a world where winter wasn't just a season, it was a predator. You wake up in London on the coldest morning anyone can remember. Your breath comes out in white puffs that freeze before they disappear. The straw mattress beneath you feels like a block of ice wrapped in scratchy fabric. Your blanket, if you can call it that, is a collection of rags that smell like wet dog and desperation. The wooden floor creaks under the weight of frost, and every surface in your one-room hovel sparkles with ice crystals that look pretty until you realise they're inside your house. Listen to the silence outside. No cars, no heating systems, humming, no electric anything. Just the occasional crack of wood expanding and contracting in the brutal cold, like the city's bones are breaking. The Thames hasn't just frozen over, it's turned into a solid highway of ice thick enough to drive a modern truck across. But you don't have trucks, you barely have shoes. You try to move, and your joints feel like they're filled with cold honey. Every breath burns your lungs like swallowing broken glass mixed with peppermint. The air tastes metallic and sharp, like licking a frozen coin. Your fingers are already numb, and you've been awake for maybe 30 seconds. Congratulations, you've just discovered what hypothermia feels like in slow motion. Here's your first historical fact of the night. The winter of 1348 was so severe that the Thames froze completely solid for several months. People held frost fairs on the ice, complete with shops, taverns and ox roasting, but that's the tourist version. The reality was that this freeze killed more Londoners than some plague outbreaks. The cold didn't discriminate. It took the rich and poor alike, though obviously the poor died faster. You sit up and the effort makes you dizzy. When did breathing become this much work? Your nose hairs have frozen into tiny icicles that break when you touch them. The water in your washing bowl has turned into a solid block of ice with air bubbles trapped inside like ancient insects in amber. You chip at it with a rusty knife, and the sound echoes in your tiny space like breaking church bells. But wait, there's more. Your urine from last night has frozen in the chamber pot. Not just frozen, it's created this grotesque yellow sculpture that somehow manages to be both hilarious and deeply depressing. Welcome to medieval plumbing in January. Every bodily function becomes a survival challenge. The walls of your hovel are made of wattle and daub, which is basically sticks and mud held together by hope and sheep's hair. In summer, it's barely adequate. In winter, it's about as useful as a screen door on a submarine. The wind finds every crack, every gap, every microscopic hole and turns your home into a wind tunnel. You can actually see your breath forming ice crystals on the walls. You need fire, desperately. But firewood costs more than food, and food costs more than most people earn in a week. The wealthy are burning their furniture. The poor are burning anything that will catch flame. Old shoes, broken cartwheels, even parchment if they're lucky enough to own any. You've heard rumours of people breaking into the churches just to steal the wooden pews for fuel. Spoiler alert, you're about to learn why medieval people went to bed when the sun went down. It wasn't romance or simplicity, it was a raw survival. Staying awake means staying warm, and staying warm means burning calories you can't afford to lose. Sleep becomes your best friend and worst enemy. You need it to conserve energy, but you might not wake up if the cold wins. You pull on what passes for clothes in 1348 London. Layers upon layers of rough wool that itch like living sandpaper. A tunic that's been worn by 3 previous owners, each of whom probably died in it. Hosea that are more whole than fabric, held together with strips of cloth and sheer determination. And shoes, if you're lucky enough to have them, that are basically leather socks with wooden soles. The smell in your room isn't just cold air. It's the accumulated scent of unwashed bodies, rotting straw, old food, and that particular medieval perfume of human desperation mixed with animal fat. In summer, it's unbearable. In winter, it freezes into a solid wall of funk that somehow becomes comforting because, at least, it's familiar. You step outside, and London hits you like a slap from God himself. The cold isn't just temperature, it's a living thing that crawls inside your clothes and makes itself at home in your bones. Your eyes start watering immediately, and the tears freeze on your cheeks like tiny ice ornaments. Very festive if you're into that whole dying of exposure aesthetic. The streets are covered in a mixture of ice, frozen mud, and what polite people call night soil. But what you and I know is frozen human waste. Every step is an adventure in not falling face first into a pile of medieval grossness that's been preserved by the cold like the world's worst popsicle. The cobblestones, where they exist, are slick enough to make you nostalgic for modern ice rinks. Listen to the sound of the city dying. Normally, London is chaos. Merchants shouting, animals bleating, wheels creaking, people arguing. Today it sounds like a library after closing time. The few people brave enough to venture outside move like elderly penguins, shuffling carefully from building to building, trying not to become human sleds. You see other people, and they look like walking scarecrows wrapped in every piece of fabric they own. A woman passes by wearing what appears to be a window curtain as a cloak. A man has stuffed his tunic with straw, making him look like a very sad medieval snowman. Children, if you see any, are bundled up so thoroughly they look like tiny wool burritos with eyes. Here's a fringe fact for you. Medieval London had no street cleaning service, which meant that garbage, animal waste, and food scraps just accumulated in the streets until rain washed them into the Thames. But when everything freezes solid, that washing stops. You're literally walking through months of accumulated medieval funk preserved for posterity by the cold. It's like a museum of gross, except you can't leave. The market stalls that are usually packed with merchants hawking everything from bread to horseshoes are mostly empty. The few vendors brave enough to set up shop have built little fortresses around their goods. Walls of hay bales, cloth barriers, anything to block the wind. Their faces are red as boiled lobsters, and their hands shake so badly they can barely count coins. You watch a baker trying to keep his bread warm by sitting on the loaves. Literally. He's got a pile of loaves under his backside like a very uncomfortable cushion. When someone wants to buy bread, he shifts his weight, pulls out a loaf that's been warmed by his body heat and hands it over. Medieval fast food at its finest. But wait, there's worse news. Your stomach is growling, but food prices have gone insane. A loaf of bread that normally cost a penny now costs 4. Ale has tripled in price, meat, forget about it. The wealthy are hoarding everything, and the poor are trying to survive on whatever they can find. Frozen turnips, old grain that's mostly mouse droppings, and hope. The animals are suffering too. Horses are dying in their stables, their water troughs frozen solid. Pigs are freezing to death in their pens, creating bacon that nobody wants. Dogs and cats roam the streets looking like furry icicles, begging for scraps from people who don't have scraps to give. You see smoke rising from chimneys, but not many. Most people can't afford fuel, so they're burning anything combustible. Furniture, books, clothes, even dried dung when they can find it. The smoke smells like desperation mixed with whatever random objects people are feeding to their fires. One chimney is belching out smoke that smells distinctly like burning shoes. A church bell rings in the distance, but it sounds muffled and strange. That's because the bell ringer's hands are so cold he can barely grip the rope, and the metal of the bell itself has contracted in the cold, changing its pitch. It's like the city's voice has deepened an octave, as if London itself has caught pneumonia. Here's your historical reality check. In medieval London, winter wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a mass extinction event that happened every year. The weak died, the old died, the young died, the poor died first and fastest, but even the wealthy weren't certain. Cold doesn't respect social status when you don't have central heating. You pull your cloak tighter and realise it's about as effective as wearing a fishnet in a rainstorm. The wind finds every gap, every loose thread, every microscopic opening and exploits it. You're not wearing clothes. You're wearing a collection of cold air pockets held together by fabric. You duck into an alehouse, not because you want to drink, but because you need to feel your fingers again. The building is packed with people who all have the same idea. Everyone's breath creates a fog bank that hovers near the ceiling like indoor weather. The air is thick enough to chew, a mixture of unwashed bodies, wet wool, and that particular aroma of people who haven't seen soap since autumn. The alehouse keeper has built a fire in the centre of the room, not in a proper fireplace, but literally in a metal pan on the floor. Everyone sits in a circle around it like they're worshipping a tiny fire god. Which honestly, they kind of are. That fire is the difference between uncomfortably cold and dead by morning. Listen to the sound of teeth chattering in harmony. It's like a medieval percussion section that nobody asked for. People are sharing body heat without shame. Strangers pressed against strangers, married couples spooning with other married couples. children tucked between adults like human hot water bottles. Personal space is a luxury nobody can afford. You order ale, partly for warmth and partly because the alcohol will help your blood flow to your extremities. The alehouse keeper's hand shakes so badly he spills half your drink before it reaches you. The ale itself is thick and cloudy with ice crystals floating on top. You drink it anyway, so all cause liquid calories are calories and calories are heat. A man next to you starts talking about the arithmetic of survival. Not actual math, just the brutal calculations everyone's making. Burn the last of your firewood tonight and maybe freeze tomorrow, or save it and definitely freeze tonight. Eat your seed grain now or plant it in spring and hope you live long enough to see the harvest. Trade your shoes for food or keep them and walk barefoot through ice. Here's your grim historical fact. During severe medieval winters, urban mortality rates could spike by 30 to 40%. People literally calculated their survival in terms of calories consumed versus calories burned. Everything became a transaction. Warmth versus food, comfort versus life today versus tomorrow. The woman across from you is knitting, but she's not making clothes. She's pulling apart old garments and re-knitting them into smaller, tighter pieces. She's literally recycling wool, unravelling a cloak to make mittens, taking apart a tunic to make a hat. Medieval upcycling, except instead of being trendy, it's life or death. You watch children playing a game that involves trying to catch each other's breath in the cold air. They cup their hands around their mouths and try to blow visible puffs of air into their palms. It's adorable until you realise they're doing it because it's one of the few ways to warm their hands without using fuel they don't have. A merchant enters, stamping his feet and cursing creatively in multiple languages. He's carrying news from outside the city walls. Villages are dying, he says. Not just people, entire communities. The cold is so severe that livestock are freezing in their barns. Wells are frozen solid and roads are impassable. London is cut off from food supplies, which explains why a turnip now costs more than most people's weekly wages. Someone mentions that the Thames is frozen so solid that merchants are setting up shops directly on the ice. It sounds magical until you think about the logistics. How do you anchor a shop to ice? What happens when the ice shifts? The answer, unfortunately, is that people fall through and die, their shops disappearing into the dark water below like medieval Atlantis. But here's the thing that really gets to you. This isn't a natural disaster that everyone's rallying together to survive. The wealthy are still wealthy, the poor are still poor, and winter has just made the inequality more obvious. Rich folks are burning oak logs in marble fireplaces, while poor people are burning their shoes in clay pots. Spoiler alert, medieval London doesn't have emergency shelters, food banks, or government assistance programs. If you can't afford fuel, you freeze. If you can't afford food, you starve. If you can't afford both, you do math problems that would make a modern accountant weep. The alehouse keeper announces that he's running low on fuel for the fire. Everyone will need to contribute something burnable, or the fire goes out. People start emptying their pockets. A wooden spoon, some parchment, a child's toy. You watch a woman throw her comb into the fire, not because she doesn't need it, but because she needs warmth more than she needs to untangle her hair. You leave a few coins on the table and head back into the cold, but not before warming your hands one last time over the communal fire. The heat feels like a blessing and a tease, wonderful while it lasts, but gone the moment you step away. You make your way through the twisted streets toward Cheapside, where the merchant houses cluster together like sheep afraid of wolves. But today, even the grand timber-framed buildings look defeated. Ice has formed stalactites along their eaves, creating a medieval cityscape that looks like the mouth of a sleeping dragon. Beautiful, sure, until one of those ice daggers falls and splits your skull like a melon. Medieval London houses weren't designed for this kind of cold. They were built for the typical English winter, damp, grey and miserable, but not freeze the marrow in your bones, miserable. The timber frames are contracting in the cold, creating gaps between boards wide enough to stick your finger. Through the daub, that mixture of clay, straw and animal dung that fills the gaps, has cracked and fallen out in chunks, leaving windows to the outside that nobody wanted. Listen to the houses groaning. Not metaphorically, literally groaning as the wood contracts and the nails pop loose from their holes. It sounds like the buildings are in pain, which they probably are. Shutters bang in the wind like applause from an audience of ghosts. Somewhere nearby you hear the crash of roof tiles sliding off and shattering on the frozen ground below. You pass a cooper's shop where the man is literally sitting inside one of his own barrels, using it as a tiny house within his house. He's got a small brazier burning inside the barrel with him, and he peers out like a hermit crab that's learned to make fire. His breath creates fog inside the barrel that escapes through the gaps in the wood, making him look like a human chimney. The wealthy merchant houses have glass in their windows, actual glass, which costs more than most people earn in a year. But even glass can't save you when it's this cold. You watch a serving woman trying to scrape ice off the inside of a glass window. The inside. The cold is so intense it's creating frost on surfaces that shouldn't be able to freeze. Here's your architectural horror story. Medieval houses had central hearths, fires built in the middle of the main room with no chimney, just a hole in the roof to let smoke escape. Great for heating, terrible for keeping warm air inside. It's like trying to heat your house with the door open. Smoke fills the room until everyone's eyes water, but at least their tears are warm. A wealthy wool merchant has hired men to stand outside his house and shovel coal into a furnace that has been built in his cellar. The men work in shifts because exposure to this cold for more than an hour can kill you. They wrap their faces in cloth, leaving only their eyes exposed, and they look like medieval ninjas whose only mission is to keep one rich man's toes warm. You peek through a cracked shutter and see a family gathered around their fireplace, but they're not just sitting near it. They've moved their entire lives into the immediate vicinity of the flames. Beds, tables, cooking pots, chamber pots, everything within arm's reach of the fire. They're living in a circle maybe 6 feet across because that's the only livable space in their house. The really wealthy have taken to sealing themselves into one room and abandoning the rest of their houses to the cold. Why heat 10 rooms when you can barely afford to heat one? Entire floors of grand houses stand empty, furniture covered in sheets that are now frozen solid. It's like the upper classes have discovered the medieval version of energy efficiency, except instead of saving money, they're saving lives. But here's where it gets really medieval. People are sleeping with their animals, not outside in barns, inside their houses. Pigs, chickens, goats, sometimes even cows, all crowded into the main living space because animal body heat is heat and heat is survival. The smell is unimaginable, but nobody cares because the alternative is waking up as a human popsicle. Fringe fact time. Some wealthy merchants have started buying beds from poor families who can no longer afford fuel to heat their bedrooms. They're literally purchasing the right to sleep warm while other people freeze on the floor. Medieval capitalism at its most brutal, the rich buy comfort while the poor sell their dreams. You watch a carpenter trying to repair a roof, but his hands are so cold he can barely hold his hammer. Every few minutes he stops to blow on his fingers and stamp his feet. The wood he's working with is so cold it's become brittle, snapping like twigs when he tries to nail it in place. He's fighting a losing battle against entropy and physics. The sound of breaking pottery echoes from a nearby house. Water expands when it freezes, and medieval pottery isn't designed for that kind of pressure. Every home is losing its containers. Jugs, bowls, cups, all cracking apart as their contents turn to ice. People are trading cooking pots like they're made of gold because once yours breaks, you might not find another one until spring. You climb the narrow stairs to an upper floor of a merchant's house, each step creaking like a dying animal under your weight. The cold has made the wood so brittle it feels like you're walking on frozen bones. Up here, away from any ground-level fires, the temperature drops another 10 degrees. Your breath creates ice crystals that fall to the floor like snow made of your own exhalations. The wealthy have discovered that heat rises, which means upper floors are death traps. Entire families have moved into their cellars and ground floors, turning their houses upside down. Servants' quarters below stairs have become premium real estate, while master bedrooms with their fancy tapestries stand empty as frozen mausoleums. Listen to the wind singing through the building like a drunk monk. Medieval construction has more gaps than a broken fence. The timber frame technique looks sturdy, but it's essentially a wooden skeleton with clay skin, and that skin's falling off in the cold. Every gust of wind finds new ways inside, creating drafts that would make modern people riot. You find a family who's built a tent inside their house, literally a tent, hanging blankets and furs from the ceiling to create a smaller, more heatable space within their larger room. They've turned architecture into camping, except the campground is their own living room, and the wilderness is the rest of their house. A wealthy spice merchant shows you his latest investment, a bed packed with hot stones. His servants heat rocks in the fire, wrap them in cloth, and pack them around his mattress like medieval heating pads. By morning the stones are cold, but for a few hours he sleeps like a king. Of course, his servants sleep on the floor next to the dying fire, but that's medieval economics for you. Here's your thermal reality check. In a typical medieval house during this winter, the temperature difference between standing next to the fire and standing 10 feet away could be 40 degrees. You're not living in a house, you're living in a series of climate zones, some of which are survivable, and some of which will kill you. The really wealthy have started wearing their clothes to bed, not just nightgowns, full daytime outfits including cloaks, boots and hats. They sleep fully dressed like medieval astronauts prepared for the cold vacuum of their own bedrooms. Some wear mittens to bed and wake up with their hands still functional, which passes for luxury in 1348. You discover the medieval version of central heating, a hypercourse system in a Roman-style bathhouse that some innovative merchant has built. Hot air from a furnace flows through the channels under the floor, warming the stones from below. It's brilliant engineering, except the furnace requires so much fuel that only the absolute wealthiest can afford to run it for more than a few hours at a time. But here's the cruel irony. The houses that are warmest belong to the fuel sellers. Coal merchants, firewood dealers, charcoal makers, they live in tropical paradises, while their customers choose between food and freezing. The woman who sells kindling has a fire so large she can afford to keep windows open for ventilation. Her house is so warm she's growing herbs indoors while everyone else is eating frozen turnips. Spoiler alert! Medieval insulation is whatever you can stuff into cracks. Straw, rags, animal hair, moss, clay, dung, anything that might slow down the wind. You see houses that look like they're growing fur as people pack organic matter into every gap. Some buildings are so thoroughly stuffed with random materials, they look like medieval quilts held up by timber frames. The church has become an unofficial warming centre, not because of religious charity, but because stone holds heat better than wood and daub. People who can't afford fuel crowd into churches during services, not to pray, but to absorb warmth from the body heat of other people. The priests preach to congregations that are there for thermal salvation rather than spiritual salvation. A blacksmith's shop becomes the neighbourhood's social centre because the forge creates actual heat. People bring food to cook over the fire, children to warm by the coals, elderly relatives to thaw out before they die. The blacksmith charges people just to stand near his workspace, medieval co-working, except instead of sharing Wi-Fi, you're sharing BTUS. You find yourself in a physician's house where a man trained in the ancient art of keeping people alive is applying medieval science to the problem of not freezing to death. He's got charts on the wall showing the 4 humours and how cold disrupts the balance of blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile in the human body. According to his medical expertise, you're dying because your humours are becoming too moist and cold. His prescription? More wine and standing closer to fires. Brilliant. The physician explains that cold is essentially evil air entering your body through your skin and corrupting your natural heat. His solution involves wearing amulets, drinking heated wine mixed with spices, and avoiding draughts that carry evil cold spirits. He's completely wrong about the science, but accidentally right about some of the solutions. Medieval medicine, wrong for all the right reasons. Listen to him grinding spices for a warming mixture. Cinnamon, ginger, cloves, pepper. Spices worth more than most people's annual income, being combined into a medieval Red Bull that's supposed to increase your internal fire. The sound of the mortar and pestle creates a rhythm that's almost comforting until you realise you can't afford any of these ingredients. He shows you his collection of warming stones, special rocks that he claims hold heat longer than regular stones because they've been blessed by saints or soaked in holy water. It's complete nonsense, but the stones do work because the stone holds heat regardless of its religious affiliations. You're witnessing the intersection of faith and physics, where superstition accidentally discovers thermodynamics. Here's your medieval medical fact. Physicians believed that cold could enter the body through the pores, so they recommended sealing your skin with oils and fats. People would coat themselves in lard, butter, or goose grease, creating human weatherproofing that actually worked as insulation, even though the theory behind it was completely wrong. The physician has developed a medieval sleeping bag made from sewn-together animal pelts lined with down feathers. He calls it a heating cocoon, and charges desperate families enormous sums to rent it for a single night. People take turns sleeping in this medieval thermal suit, sharing warmth like a medical device passed from house to house. A wealthy merchant's wife has hired the physician to supervise her warming routine, a daily schedule of heated baths, warmed wine, and sitting in rooms with multiple fires. She's essentially invented the medieval spa day, except instead of relaxation, she's paying for the privilege of not dying of hypothermia in her own home. But here's where medieval ingenuity actually works. People have figured out that shared body heat is the most efficient heating system available. Families sleep in piles like puppies, with children in the middle and adults on the outside. Personal modesty has been sacrificed to the god of thermal efficiency. Everyone sleeps skin to skin, sharing warmth like a human heat exchange system. The physician shows you his warming chamber, a small room where he's hung mirrors to reflect heat from a central fire. It's primitive solar heating and it actually works. The mirrors focus and amplify the fire's warmth, creating a space that's survivably warm, using less fuel than traditional heating methods. Medieval physics accidentally discovering the principles of thermal reflection. Fringe medical fact: some physicians prescribe heat dancing, vigorous movement designed to generate internal warmth through muscle activity. People gather in groups and dance frantically by fires, not for entertainment, but as medical treatment. It's like medieval aerobics, except the workout is literally life or death. You watch the physician treating a case of frostbite, blackened fingers that have frozen solid. His treatment involves gradual rewarming using heated wine and wrapped warm stones, which is actually close to correct modern treatment. He has no idea why it works, but generations of trial and error have taught him what helps and what makes things worse. The really wealthy hire professional warmers, people whose job is to heat their beds before they get in. These human heating pads climb into cold beds, warm them with body heat, then climb out so their employers can slide into pre-warmed sleeping spaces. It's the most intimate job that nobody talks about, and it pays better than most medieval professions. You make your way to the market, what's left of it, and discover that winter has turned basic survival into a luxury economy. A single log that would normally cost a penny now costs a shilling. A pound of coal, if you can find it, costs more than a skilled craftsman earns in a week. The price of staying alive has inflated faster than a modern real estate market, except instead of housing, you're buying the right to not freeze to death. The fuel merchants have become medieval oil barons. They sit in their warm shops counting coins while customers literally beg, for just enough firewood to last the night. Some vendors are accepting trade goods instead of money. A chicken for a bundle of kindling, a cloak for a bag of charcoal, a child's toy for enough fuel to cook one meal. Listen to the sound of people breaking things, not in anger but out of necessity. Wooden spoons become fuel, old stools get chopped up for kindling. People are systematically destroying their possessions to feed their fires, turning their material lives into thermal energy one piece at a time. It's like watching civilization eat itself to stay warm. A bread seller has moved his entire operation next to a blacksmith's forge because he can't afford fuel for his own ovens. He pays the blacksmith in bread to use forge heat for baking. The bread comes out tasting like iron and coal smoke, but it's hot and it's food, which makes it worth more than gold in this frozen wasteland. Here's your economic horror story. People are selling their children's clothes, not because they don't love their children, but because adult clothes can be altered for children, while children's clothes can be sold for fuel money. Parents are making mathematical calculations about which family members need warmth the most. Medieval triage, where love gets weighed against thermal efficiency. A wool merchant shows you his newest business model. He's renting warmth by the hour. Customers pay to sit in his shop next to his fire for predetermined amounts of time. He's got an hourglass that measures thermal time, and when the sand runs out, you're back in the cold. It's like medieval internet cafes, except instead of browsing, you're trying not to die. You watch a woman trading her wedding ring for a single night's worth of firewood. The ring is beautiful, probably worth more than most people see in a lifetime, but beauty doesn't burn and sentiment doesn't generate heat. The fuel seller examines the ring, weighs it in his palm, and hands over exactly 3 pieces of wood. Medieval priorities. Love is eternal, but hypothermia is immediate. The really desperate have started a medieval gig economy. People with strong backs hire themselves out as human heaters. They'll lie next to you in bed for money, sharing body heat like thermal chicken. It's not sexual, it's survival. Professional warmers advertise their services like any other trade. Experienced human heater. Reasonable rates, references available. But here's where medieval economics gets truly bizarre. The price of ice is higher than the price of ale. People are buying ice to preserve food because if you're going to freeze anyway, you might as well freeze with a stocked pantry. Merchants are harvesting ice from the Thames and selling it like a precious commodity, which it is when your cellars have turned into frozen storage lockers. Spoiler alert, the church has gotten into the heating business. Priests are selling warming prayers, special benedictions that supposedly increase your internal spiritual fire. They're a complete nonsense, but desperate people pay anyway because hope generates its own kind of heat. Some churches are charging admission just to attend services in heated buildings. A spice merchant has become a medieval drug dealer, selling small amounts of warming spices, ginger, cinnamon, pepper, to people who mix them into hot drinks for internal heating. A pinch of pepper costs a day's wages, but it makes you feel warm from the inside out. Spice addiction becomes a thing when spices are literally life-saving medicine. You discover a black market in stolen fuel. People are breaking into wealthy houses to steal logs, coal, even furniture to burn for warmth. The penalties for theft are severe: flogging, branding, sometimes death. But when the alternative is freezing, even medieval justice seems like a reasonable risk. You follow rumours to a warehouse district where enterprising merchants have turned human suffering into profitable business opportunities. A cloth seller has created survival bundles, collections of rags, scraps and damaged fabric sold as insulation materials. Nothing matches, everything smells like previous and poor owners, but it's layers, and layers mean life. The really innovative entrepreneurs have started selling warmth subscriptions. Pay up front for a winter's worth of daily fuel deliveries like medieval Amazon Prime, except the only product is not dying. The wealthy buy full subscriptions while the poor pool their money for shared deliveries, creating heating cooperatives where neighbours take turns using communal fuel. Listen to the negotiations happening in every shop, not haggling over price but haggling over payment terms. I'll give you my pig in spring if you give me firewood now. Take my silver cup and let me pay the rest in labour next summer. Everyone's mortgaging their future to survive their present, creating a debt economy based on thermal desperation. A candle maker has pivoted to selling warming candles made with extra fat and larger wicks that burn hotter and brighter. They cost 5 times normal candles, but they provide both light and heat in a single product. He's accidentally invented the medieval space heater, and his shop is packed with customers willing to pay premium prices for premium warmth. Here's your entrepreneurial nightmare. Coffin makers are doing booming business, not just because people are dying, but because desperate families are buying cheap coffins to break apart for firewood. The wood is well seasoned and burns cleanly, making death boxes into thermal salvation. Medieval recycling where funeral goods become fuel goods. A blacksmith has started offering warming services where customers bring metal objects to be heated in his forge, then carry them home as portable heaters. People walk through the streets clutching hot horseshoes, heated tools, warm metal plates, anything that can hold and radiate thermal energy. The city looks like everyone's carrying medieval hand warmers. You meet an alehouse keeper who's created tiered pricing based on proximity to his fire. Seats close to the flames cost premium prices, while spots near the walls are cheaper but potentially lethal. He's turned his establishment into a thermal theatre, where the stage is a fire and the audience pays based on how close they can afford to sit to survival. The wealthy have hired fuel guards, armed men whose job is to protect stockpiles of firewood and coal from desperate thieves. These thermal mercenaries patrol fuel storage areas like medieval security guards, except instead of protecting money, they are protecting the raw materials of not freezing to death. Some guards are paid in fuel rather than coins, but here's the really medieval part. People are selling their futures. Indentured servitude contracts where people agree to work for wealthy families for years in exchange for immediate heating. They are literally selling themselves into temporary slavery for the privilege of not dying in the next few weeks. Medieval payday loans with human collateral. Fringe economic fact. Some merchants have started accepting body heaters. Payment. Customers work in shops providing warmth through physical presence, and in exchange receive goods or services. Human furnaces get fed, shop owners save on fuel costs, and everyone stays slightly less dead. It's the most intimate form of labour exchange ever invented. A wine merchant has discovered that alcohol sales skyrocket during cold snaps, not because people want to get drunk, but because alcohol creates the sensation of internal warmth. He's marketing wine as medical supplies, advertising different varieties for their warming properties. Medieval energy drinks, except they actually work and also get you tipsy. You watch a group of children selling their services as message runners between heated buildings. They sprint from warm shop to warm shop, carrying communications for people who can't afford to expose themselves to the cold. Child labour becomes child thermal logistics, where small bodies that generate heat quickly become valuable economic resources. The funeral industry has created package deals, death, burial, and heating services bundled together. Families can prepay for funerals with the understanding that fuel will be provided for wakes and mourning periods. Death merchants selling thermal comfort alongside eternal rest because grieving in the cold is just adding insult to mortal injury. You enter what used to be a thriving food market and find yourself in an economics lesson taught by hunger and hypothermia. Food prices haven't just increased, they've entered a different mathematical universe. A loaf of bread that cost a penny in autumn now costs 8 pence, assuming you can find bread at all. Most vendors have closed their stalls and gone home to burn their remaining stock for fuel rather than sell it for food. The few food sellers still operating have become medieval derivatives traders, selling promises of future food rather than actual food. I'll have turnips next week, pay me now and I'll save you some. People are buying imaginary meals with real money, gambling their survival on agricultural futures that may never materialise. Listen to the sound of empty stomachs growling in harmony with chattering teeth. The human body burns calories to generate heat, so the colder you get, the hungrier you become. But food costs money, and fuel costs money, and most people don't have enough money for both. It's a biological equation with no good solutions. Starve and freeze, or eat and freeze, or burn everything and do both. A baker shows you his new product line, Fuel Bread, made from sawdust, straw and whatever grain he can afford. It's barely edible and provides almost no nutrition, but it burns calories during digestion, which generates internal heat. People are literally eating kindling disguised as food. Medieval meal replacement bars, except they're designed to be thermal rather than nutritious. Here's your starvation mathematics. A person needs about 1,500 calories per day to survive in normal conditions. But in extreme cold, that number jumps to 2,500 or more. Meanwhile, food availability has dropped by half and prices have increased by 400%. The human body requires more fuel precisely when fuel becomes impossibly expensive. The wealthy have hired food tasters not to check for poison, but to check for quality in an era when desperation makes people sell spoiled, frozen, or contaminated food at premium prices. Rich folks pay extra for the privilege of eating food that won't kill them, while poor people eat whatever they can find and hope their immune systems can handle medieval Russian roulette. You discover a thriving trade in thermal foods, hot soups, mulled wine, heated ale, that cost enormous amounts but provide both calories and warmth in a single purchase. A bowl of hot soup costs more than a day's wages, but it's the only way to get warm food into your body without having fuel to heat it yourself. Medieval fast food, where the fast part is how quickly your money disappears. A spice merchant explains the economics of internal heating. Certain spices generate warmth from within, but they cost more per ounce than silver. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves. They are not seasonings anymore, they're medicines. People buy tiny amounts and stretch them through entire meals, turning every bite into a thermal investment. But here's the cruelest irony. The cold preserves food perfectly, so there's actually plenty of food available. The problem is that it's all frozen solid and nobody can afford fuel to thaw it. Warehouses full of meat, grain and vegetables sit like Arctic storage lockers while people starve outside, unable to access food that's been naturally preserved by the same cold that's killing them. Spoiler alert, medieval food storage wasn't designed for this kind of cold. Clay pots crack, wooden barrels split, and leather containers become brittle and leak. Even if you have food, you might not have anything to store it in. People are eating entire meals at once because they can't save portions for later without proper containers. A butcher shows you his adaptation strategy. He's started selling warming meat, cuts that are specifically selected for their fat content because fat generates more heat when digested. Pork belly, beef fat, lamb suet, cuts that were previously considered scraps are now premium products. Medieval ketogenic diet, where the goal isn't weight loss but thermal generation. You watch families making horrible decisions in real time. Feed the children and let the adults go hungry, or feed the adults and hope the children survive on body heat. Eat today and have nothing tomorrow, or save food and risk not living to see tomorrow. medieval trolley problems where every choice leads to suffering. You find yourself in the company of a barber surgeon who's become an unwilling expert in what extreme cold does to human bodies. His shop smells like blood, fear, and that particular metallic scent of flesh that's been frozen and thawed too many times. He shows you his collection of amputated fingers, toes, and worse, body parts that turned black and dead from frostbite, removed to prevent the rot from spreading to the rest of the person. The human body, he explains while sharpening his bone saw, wasn't designed for this kind of cold. Your fingers and toes are the first to surrender, blood retreating to your core to keep vital organs alive. What starts as numbness progresses to pain, then to a complete absence of feeling as nerve endings die. People walk around on feet they can't feel, using hands that no longer obey their commands. Listen to the sound of someone screaming in the next room. The barber surgeon is performing an amputation without anesthesia because alcohol's too expensive to waste on pain relief and opium doesn't exist yet. The patient is conscious throughout the procedure, held down by friends while dead tissue is carved away from living flesh. Medieval surgery where the cure is almost as likely to kill you as the disease. He shows you the stages of frostbite like a medieval medical textbook written in human suffering. First, the skin turns red and painful, frost nip, he calls it, easily treated with gradual rewarming. Then comes superficial frostbite, where the skin turns white and waxy, followed by blisters that form when the tissue thaws. Finally, deep frostbite, where skin turns white or bluish-grey and becomes hard as wood. Here's your anatomical horror story. When body parts freeze completely, they don't just get cold, they crystallize. Ice forms inside cells, expanding and rupturing them from within. The tissue literally explodes at a microscopic level, which is why frostbitten skin turns black and falls off. Your body parts are committing cellular suicide to prevent the cold from spreading. A woman brings in her husband whose nose has turned black and fallen off. Not metaphorically, literally fallen off, leaving a gaping hole in his face where his nose used to be. The barber surgeon examines the wound and explains that facial extremities are particularly vulnerable because there's not enough muscle mass to generate heat. Medieval plastic surgery involves learning to live with whatever pieces of your face survive winter. The really horrifying cases involve people who've frozen in their sleep and partially thawed by morning. Their skin has turned mottled blue and white like marble made of flesh. Some can be saved with gradual rewarming, but others have essentially died and come back to life as walking corpses, their extremities dead while their cores remain alive. But here's the part that would make modern doctors weep. Medieval treatment for frostbite involves rubbing the affected area with snow or ice to gradually warm the tissue. It's exactly the wrong thing to do, like trying to cure drowning with more water, but it's the best medical knowledge available. People are literally making their frostbite worse while trying to treat it. Spoiler alert, gangrene loves cold weather. When frostbitten tissue begins to rot, it creates infections that can kill you faster than the cold itself. The barber surgeon shows you cases where small patches of frostbite have become spreading infections that consume entire limbs. Medieval antibiotics don't exist, so infection becomes a race between amputation and death. A child is brought in with frostbitten ears that have turned purple and started to swell. The barber surgeon heats honey over a candle and applies it to the damaged tissue, not because honey is medicine, but because it's one of the few substances available that can be warmed and spread over skin. Medieval first aid using whatever materials don't freeze solid. The wealthy hire professional body warmers, people whose job is to prevent frostbite by maintaining circulation in their employer's extremities. These human heating pads massage hands and feet, provide shared body heat, and monitor for signs of tissue death. It's the most intimate medical care available, and it actually works better than most medieval treatments. Fringe medical fact: some people have started practicing deliberate frostbite, allowing minor extremities like fingertips to freeze and fall off before the damage spreads to more important body parts. Self-amputation as preventive medicine, where you sacrifice pieces of yourself to save the whole. Medieval surgical triage performed with hypothermia. You sit with a monk who's been documenting the psychological effects of extreme cold on his monastery's residents. He speaks in quiet, measured tones about how winter doesn't just attack the body, it invades the mind, changing people's thoughts, behaviours, and very personalities. Cold, he believes, is a form of possession, but instead of demons, it's physics that takes control of human consciousness. The mind, deprived of physical comfort, begins to make strange calculations. people become obsessed with thermal efficiency, measuring everything in terms of heat generation and heat loss. Conversations revolve around fuel, fire, and the mathematics of survival. Medieval people are developing what modern psychologists would recognize as obsessive-compulsive behaviors, but instead of cleanliness or counting, they're compulsed by warmth. Listen to the sound of people talking to themselves, not from loneliness, but from a psychological strategy the monk has observed. Speaking aloud generates breath, which creates visible warmth, which provides the illusion of control over body temperature. Self-talk becomes self-heating, and the boundary between sanity and thermal strategy grows thin. He shows you his notes on winter madness, a condition where prolonged cold exposure leads to irrational behavior, hallucinations, and complete personality changes. Some people become aggressive, fighting over fuel and warmth. Others become catatonic, sitting motionless for hours as if they're conserving mental energy, along with physical energy. A few become manic, convinced that vigorous activity will generate enough heat to survive indefinitely. Here's your psychological fact. The human brain burns about 20% of your body's calories, and cold weather increases overall caloric needs while decreasing food availability. People are literally thinking themselves into starvation, as mental activity competes with physical activity for limited energy resources. Medieval multitasking, where every thought costs calories you can't afford to spend. A wealthy merchant's wife has developed what the monk calls thermal paranoia, an obsessive fear that heat is escaping from her body faster than she can replace it. She checks and rechecks, fires, layers and relayers clothing, and measures the temperature of everything she eats or drinks. She's turned survival into a full-time mental occupation that's slowly driving her insane. The monastery has become a laboratory for cold weather psychology. Monks who once spent hours in contemplative prayer now spend hours obsessing about fuel consumption. Religious meditation has been replaced by thermal meditation, focusing on breath not as spiritual practice but as a way to monitor body heat. God has been temporarily displaced by thermodynamics. But here's the really disturbing part. People are beginning to forget what warmth feels like. Children who have spent months in extreme cold can't remember summer. Adults lose the ability to imagine comfort, as if their brains are adapting to perpetual misery by editing out the memory of alternatives. Medieval Stockholm Syndrome, except instead of captors, they're bonding with their suffering. Spoiler alert, sleep becomes psychologically dangerous. Dreams of warmth are so vivid and pleasant that people don't want to wake up, even when staying asleep means freezing to death. The monk describes cases of people who died smiling in their sleep, apparently dreaming of summer while their bodies surrendered to hypothermia. Medieval virtual reality where the simulation is more appealing than survival. A group of children have invented games that revolve entirely around imaginary heat. They play summer, pretending to be too hot and removing layers of clothing. They play fire, taking turns being flames while others gather around for pretend warmth. Child psychology adapting to circumstances by creating thermal fantasy worlds. The really wealthy hire cheerfulness consultants, people whose job is to maintain optimistic conversation and pleasant demeanour to prevent their employers from falling into cold weather depression. Professional happiness providers who charge premium rates to remind rich people that spring will eventually return and life might someday be pleasant again. Fringe, psychological fact. Some people develop heat hallucinations, visual and tactile sensations of warmth that don't exist. They see fires that aren't there, feel heat from cold objects, and experience phantom comfort that provides real psychological relief even though it doesn't change their physical temperature. Medieval placebo effects where belief in warmth generates actual mental warmth. You encounter a priest who's been giving last rites to people who aren't dying from disease or injury, but from the simple act of existing in a world that's become incompatible with human life. These aren't dramatic deaths. No battles, no plagues, no accidents. Just the quiet surrender of people who've calculated that the effort required to stay alive exceeds their available resources. He speaks about the mathematics of giving up, a phenomenon he's observed where people make rational decisions to stop fighting for survival. They've run out of fuel, food, and hope simultaneously, and they choose to die warm rather than live cold. Some gather their remaining combustibles, build one final magnificent fire, and sit beside it as it burns down along with their lives. Listen to the sound of silence in houses where families have made collective decisions to stop struggling. No crying, no arguing, no desperation. Just quiet acceptance as people lie down together and wait for hypothermia to take them peacefully. It's suicide without violence, death by mathematical reasoning rather than emotional breakdown. The priest shows you a phenomenon he calls thermal triage, where families decide which members are most likely to survive and concentrate all resources on keeping those people alive while allowing others to die. Parents sacrifice themselves for children, or children are allowed to die to save adults who can work. Medieval Sophie's choice played out in thousands of homes across the frozen city. Here's your existential crisis. When survival becomes impossible, death becomes rational. People aren't dying from despair, they're dying from arithmetic. They've calculated their caloric needs, measured their available resources, and concluded that the equation doesn't balance. Medieval actuarial science applied to individual mortality. A wealthy widow has hired the priest to help her decide which of her servants to save and which to let die. She can afford to keep 3 people warm and fed through winter, but she employs 7. The priest helps her make theological and practical decisions about who deserves salvation and who will be sacrificed to resource limitations. Playing God with thermal resources. Some people have developed what the priest calls death preparation rituals, elaborate ceremonies for preparing to die of cold. They arrange their possessions, write final letters, and create detailed instructions for their funerals, all while still alive and relatively healthy. Medieval estate planning for people whose estates consist entirely of frozen belongings. But here's the most haunting aspect. Children are accepting death with mature rationality that would impress philosophers. Kids as young as 8 or 9 understand that their families can't afford to keep everyone alive, and they volunteer to go to heaven early to save food and fuel for siblings. Medieval martyrdom where the sacrifice is thermal rather than spiritual. Spoiler alert, the breaking point isn't when people run out of resources, it's when they run out of the will to continue managing resources. People die with food in their pantries and fuel in their woodpiles because they've become psychologically incapable of continuing the exhausting work of staying alive. Medieval depression, where the symptom is fatal procrastination. A group of merchants have created a death lottery, where participants draw lots to determine who will receive the group's combined resources and who will be left to die. It's gambling with mortality as the stakes, and people participate voluntarily because random death feels more fair than death by economic status. Medieval probability theory applied to thermal distribution. The priest performs a new kind of service, living funerals where people say goodbye to family members who've decided to stop fighting but haven't died yet. Families gather around people who are still alive but have committed to dying, creating closure rituals for deaths that haven't happened but are inevitable. Medieval grief counselling for premeditated mortality. Fringe theological fact. Some people believe that dying of cold is a form of religious purification, that suffering in winter cleanses the soul for entry into heaven. They've turned hypothermia into a spiritual practice, embracing death by freezing as a form of holy martyrdom. Medieval theology where dying becomes a sacrament and suffering becomes salvation. You discover that extreme cold has restructured medieval society faster than any war or plague ever could. The traditional hierarchies based on birthright, land ownership, and feudal obligation have been temporarily suspended in favour of a new aristocracy, those who control heat. A coal merchant's apprentice now has more social power than a knight without firewood. A peasant with a well-stocked woodpile receives more deference than a lord whose castle has run out of fuel. The wealthy, accustomed to comfort as a birthright, find themselves begging fuel merchants for basic survival necessities. You watch a duke's daughter trading family jewellery for a single night's worth of heating, while the blacksmith who sells her the coal treats her with casual indifference. Medieval social mobility where the currency is thermal rather than financial, and everyone's status gets recalculated daily based on their access to warmth. Listen to the new vocabulary of social interaction. Instead of "my lord" and "your grace," people address each other with thermal honorifics: keeper of flames, master of coals, guardian of warmth. Social respect has been redistributed according to heat management capabilities. The most important person in any room isn't the richest or highest born, but whoever controls the fire. A wool merchant shows you how old business relationships have been restructured around thermal partnerships. Instead of trading goods for money, people trade goods for heating services. A baker provides bread in exchange for access to a blacksmith's forge. A tavern keeper offers ale for firewood deliveries. medieval barter economy where the medium of exchange is BTUS rather than currency. Here's your social revolution. Servants are abandoning wealthy employers who can't afford to heat their houses, while simultaneously wealthy people are applying to become servants in homes that can provide warmth. Social status has inverted completely. It's better to be a warm servant than a cold master. Medieval job market where employment benefits are measured in degrees rather than wages. The church has lost much of its moral authority because salvation in the afterlife seems less urgent than survival in the present. People who once donated money to buy their way into heaven are now spending every coin on fuel to avoid immediate death. Priests find themselves competing with fuel merchants for people's resources and attention, and the fuel merchants are winning because their product provides immediate, measurable results. Marriage contracts are being rewritten to include thermal provisions. Couples are negotiating prenuptial agreements that specify fuel-sharing responsibilities, heating duties and resource allocation in case of extreme weather. Medieval romance where, for better or worse, gets redefined as in warmth and in cold, and love is measured by willingness to share body heat. But here's the really medieval twist. New forms of nobility are emerging based on the thermal competence. People who demonstrate exceptional skill at fire management, fuel conservation, or heat generation are being elevated to positions of community leadership regardless of their birth status. Medieval meritocracy where merit is defined by the ability to keep people from freezing to death. Spoiler alert, children are becoming thermal advisors to adults. Kids who grew up poor and learned efficient heating strategies are now teaching wealthy families how to survive on limited fuel. Social hierarchies have not just flattened, they've completely inverted, with knowledge about survival techniques becoming more valuable than inherited wealth or political power. A group of merchants has formed what they call a warmth guild, a professional organisation that controls fuel distribution, heating services, and thermal technologies. Guild membership provides access to exclusive heating arrangements and bulk fuel purchasing, creating a new form of medieval social club, where admission criteria focus on thermal resources rather than social connections. The legal system has adapted to thermal crimes. Courts now prosecute fuel theft as seriously as horse stealing, and thermal assault, deliberately exposing someone to cold, is treated as a form of battery. New laws define property rights for heat, sources, fuel stockpiles, and even warm sleeping spots. Medieval jurisprudence where justice gets measured in degrees. Fringe social fact, some communities have instituted thermal democracy, where important decisions are made by whoever can afford to heat the meeting space. Political power flows to those with fuel resources, creating governance systems based on heating capacity rather than voting rights. Medieval politics, where the currency of influence is literally fire. You find yourself witnessing the collapse of medieval privacy as survival forces people into physical intimacy that would have been scandalous in normal times. Strangers sleep pressed against strangers, sharing body heat without shame or sexual implication. Personal boundaries have been redefined by thermal necessity. Modesty is a luxury nobody can afford when skin-to-skin contact might mean the difference between life and death. Families who once occupied entire houses now live in single rooms, all gathered around one fire like medieval camping trips that never end. Parents sleep with children, grandparents share beds with grandchildren, and unmarried relatives cluster together in sleeping arrangements that would normally violate every social convention. Medieval social distancing has been replaced by medieval social compression. Listen to the sounds of communal sleeping, dozens of people breathing, snoring, shifting, and murmuring in spaces designed for individual families. Privacy has become impossible when survival requires group body heat management. People learn to ignore each other's bodily functions, personal hygiene habits, and intimate conversations because the alternative is freezing alone in private. A wealthy merchant family has invited their servants to sleep in the master bedroom because combined body heat is more efficient than social protocol. Masters and servants lie side by side, sharing warmth and breath while maintaining careful conversational boundaries that preserve class distinctions even when physical distinctions have collapsed. Medieval integration through hypothermia. Here's your intimacy revolution. Medieval marriage customs are being temporarily suspended because single people die faster than couples. Unmarried adults are entering thermal partnerships, platonic relationships designed purely for shared body heat and resource pooling. Churches are performing survival ceremonies that create temporary family units for the duration of winter, with dissolution planned for spring. Bathing, already rare in medieval times, has become communal out of necessity. Groups of people share tubs of heated water because nobody can afford to heat individual baths. Public bathing has evolved from luxury service to survival necessity, with people taking turns in the same warm water regardless of social status, gender, or marital status. The concept of personal space has been mathematically redefined by thermal efficiency. People calculate optimal body usage, positioning for heat sharing, learning to sleep in formations that maximize warmth distribution. Medieval geometry where angles and distances are determined by thermodynamics rather than comfort or preference. But here's the psychologically complex part. People are falling in love with their thermal partners. Arranged marriages for survival are turning into genuine romantic relationships because shared suffering creates emotional bonds. Medieval speed dating where the matching criteria are body heat compatibility and fuel-sharing agreements rather than personality or attraction. Spoiler alert, children are being raised communally because individual childcare is thermally inefficient. Kids move between families based on where resources are available, creating temporary adoption networks that redistribute children according to heating capacity rather than blood relationships. Medieval foster care where placement decisions are made by thermostats rather than social workers. Women who've never worked outside their homes are becoming the professional body warmers, hired by wealthy families to provide thermal services. It's intimate labour that exists in a grey area between medical care and personal service, creating new forms of employment that would be unthinkable in warmer times. Medieval healthcare, where the treatment is human contact and the medicine is shared body temperature. A monastery has opened its doors to lay people for communal sleeping arrangements, creating mixed-gender religious communities that exist purely for thermal survival. Monks and civilians sleep side by side in arrangements that violate monastic vows, but preserve human life. Medieval theology wrestling with the question of whether survival trumps spiritual discipline. Fringe intimacy a fact. Some people are entering into death partnerships where they agree to die together, rather than face the loneliness of freezing alone. These aren't romantic relationships, but practical arrangements between people who prefer shared mortality to isolated survival. Medieval buddy system for dying, where nobody faces hypothermia without companionship. You discover that prolonged exposure to extreme cold has created an entirely new cultural framework where every human activity gets filtered through thermal considerations. Art, music, literature, and entertainment have all been redefined around the central theme of heat management and cold survival. Medieval creativity has been focused into a laser beam of thermal obsession that produces innovations nobody wanted but everybody needs. Musicians have developed warming songs, musical compositions designed to encourage physical movement that generates body heat. These aren't dance songs but exercise instructions set to melody, where the lyrics provide directions for thermal calisthenics and the rhythm encourages heat-generating physical activity. Medieval fitness videos performed by troubadours who understand that entertainment must serve survival. Listen to the new folk songs emerging from taverns and alehouses. Instead of tales of heroic knights and romantic love, people are singing about successful fire-starting techniques, efficient fuel conservation methods, and the thermal properties of different materials. Medieval pop music where the hit songs are instructional manuals set to catchy tunes. Storytellers have adapted their craft to thermal education, creating narratives that embed survival information within entertaining plots. Children learn about fire safety through fairy tales, where the heroes are wise fuel conservationists and the villains are people who waste heat. Medieval edutainment where every story doubles as a survival manual and entertainment exists to transmit thermal knowledge. Here's your cultural revolution. Religious festivals have been redesigned around communal heat generation. Instead of solemn ceremonies in cold churches, people are celebrating saints' days with vigorous group activities that create shared body heat, religious dancing, communal cooking, and thermal processions where faith gets expressed through calorie-burning community activities. Artists are creating new forms of visual art designed to psychologically warm viewers. Paintings of fires, summer scenes, and tropical imagery are commissioned not for beauty, but for the mental comfort they provide to people suffering from cold. Medieval therapy art where aesthetic value is measured by thermal psychological impact rather than technical skill or religious significance. The wealthy are commissioning warming portraits, paintings of themselves enjoying imaginary heat sources, surrounded by fires, summer gardens, and tropical abundance. These aren't realistic representations, but aspirational thermal fantasies designed to provide psychological comfort during actual physical suffering. Medieval vision boards where the vision is always warmth. But here's the innovation that would impress modern engineers. Medieval people have developed thermal architecture that integrates heating systems with social spaces. New buildings are designed around central heat sources, with rooms arranged in concentric circles based on temperature zones. Medieval urban planning where city layouts prioritize thermal efficiency over convenience, beauty, or traditional design principles. Spoiler alert, fashion has evolved into purely functional thermal engineering. Clothing is no longer about status, beauty, or religious modesty. It's about heat retention, wind resistance, and thermal layering. Medieval haute couture where the runway shows are survival competitions, and the models are judged on their ability to stay alive rather than look attractive. Educational systems have been reorganized around thermal literacy. Children learn mathematics by calculating fuel consumption rates, study geography by understanding climate zones, and practice writing by copying thermal instruction manuals. Medieval curriculum. Development where every subject gets filtered through cold weather survival applications. Games and entertainment have evolved into thermal skill-building activities. Gambling games involve betting on fire-starting competitions, children play fuel conservation instead of traditional games, and athletic competitions focus on heat-generating activities rather than strength or speed. Medieval recreation where fun must serve survival and entertainment must provide thermal education. Fringe cultural fact. Some communities have developed cold cults, religious movements that worship winter as a divine test, embracing suffering as spiritual purification. These groups practice deliberate exposure to cold as a religious discipline, turning hypothermia into theological practice. Medieval extremism where the extreme is literal temperature rather than ideological fervour. You find yourself in the workshop of an inventor who's been forced to become a medieval thermal engineer out of sheer desperation. His shop is filled with contraptions that look like medieval torture devices, but are actually heating innovations, complex systems for capturing, conserving, and distributing heat, using materials and techniques available in 1348. These aren't elegant solutions, they're desperate adaptations created by someone who understands that death by freezing is an engineering problem with life or death stakes. The inventor shows you his masterpiece, a heat recycling system made from clay pipes, metal plates, and wool insulation that captures warm air from fires and circulates it through multiple rooms. It's crude, inefficient, and occasionally fills houses with smoke, but it works well enough to keep wealthy families from freezing in rooms that don't have direct access to fires. Medieval HVAC systems designed by someone who learned engineering through trial and error, where errors kill people. Listen to the sound of his latest experiment. A thermal storage battery made from large stones that are heated in fires during the day and wrapped in cloth to provide warmth through the night. The stones crack from rapid temperature changes, sometimes exploding and sending hot fragments across rooms, but when they work, they provide hours of heat without additional fuel. Medieval space heaters that occasionally function as medieval grenades. He demonstrates his collection of heat amplifiers, polished metal sheets positioned around fires to reflect and focus thermal energy, mirrors made from whatever reflective materials he can acquire, and curved surfaces that concentrate heat into smaller areas. Some actually work, increasing heating efficiency by measurable amounts. Others just look scientific while accomplishing nothing, but desperate customers buy them anyway because hope itself provides psychological warmth. Here's your medieval physics lesson. The inventor has discovered that different materials hold heat for different amounts of time, leading him to create composite heating elements that combine stone, metal, clay, and organic materials in systems designed to maximize thermal retention. He's accidentally invented principles of thermodynamics through desperate experimentation, understanding heat transfer without understanding why it works. A wealthy widow has hired him to design a personal heating suit, a wearable system of heated metal plates, insulated pockets for warm stones, and layered fabrics that create a micro-environment of warmth around the wearer. It's bulky, expensive, and occasionally sets its wearer on fire, but it allows people to move through cold spaces while maintaining core body temperature. Medieval spacesuits designed for survival on planet Winter. The inventor's most successful innovation is a group heating pod, a tent-like structure that can be assembled inside existing rooms to create smaller, more efficiently heated spaces. Multiple people cluster inside these thermal tents, sharing body heat and conserving warm air in a space small enough to be heated with minimal fuel. Medieval camping gear for indoor use where the wilderness is your own house. But here's the really impressive part. He's developed heat distribution networks that connect multiple buildings through underground pipes filled with heated air or water. Entire neighbourhoods can share thermal resources, creating community heating systems that allow fuel-sharing cooperatives to keep multiple families warm with shared resources. Medieval district heating using technology that won't be reinvented for centuries. Spoiler alert, most of his inventions don't work very well, but the act of trying to solve thermal problems provides psychological benefits that are almost as valuable as actual heat. People who believe they have some control over their thermal destiny show measurably better survival rates than people who passively accept their fate. Medieval placebo effect where engineering optimism generates real survival advantages. The inventor has also created what he calls heat multiplication systems, arrangements of reflective surfaces, airflow channels, and thermal mass that theoretically increase the effective heat output of fires. Some are based on genuine physical principles, others are complete nonsense, but all of them give customers the feeling that they're fighting back against winter rather than simply enduring it. His workshop serves as a medieval think tank where desperate people brainstorm thermal solutions using whatever materials and knowledge are available. Group engineering sessions where blacksmiths, carpenters, and housewives collaborate on heating innovations that combine professional expertise with survival desperation. Medieval research and development where the research is life or death and the development happens in real time. Fringe engineering fact. Some inventors have created sacrificial heating systems designed to burn down in controlled ways, providing maximum heat output, for short periods before destroying themselves. These are essentially planned house fires that provide intense warmth before consuming the structures they're built to heat. Medieval thermal kamikaze engineering where the solution destroys itself into the process of working. You enter the laboratory of an alchemist who's abandoned his search for gold in favour of something more valuable. Reliable methods for generating and preserving heat. His workspace is filled with bubbling concoctions, smoking braziers, and experimental mixtures that promise to revolutionise thermal technology. Some actually work, others explode spectacularly, and a few seem to violate the known laws of medieval physics while accomplishing absolutely nothing useful. The alchemist explains his theory that heat is a substance that can be captured, concentrated and stored like many others material. He's developed warming potions, liquid mixtures that generate heat when consumed, creating internal fires that warm the body from within. Some contain alcohol, spices, and herbs that actually do increase circulation and body temperature. Others contain ingredients that sound scientific but are complete medieval nonsense. Listen to the bubbling of his latest experiment. A perpetual heat source made from chemical reactions that generate warmth without consuming wood or coal. He mixes substances that create exothermic reactions, combinations of materials that produce heat when combined. Most of his experiments fail catastrophically, filling his laboratory with toxic fumes or creating small explosions, but occasionally he discovers combinations that actually work. He demonstrates his collection of thermal enhancers, powders and liquids that can be added to fires to increase their heat output, change their burning characteristics, or extend their duration. Some are legitimate fire starters made from sulfur, saltpeter, and other combustible materials. Others are expensive placebos that smell impressive while accomplishing nothing except separating desperate customers from their money. Here's your medieval chemistry lesson. The alchemist has discovered that certain metallic compounds change colour when heated, leading him to develop thermal indicators that show the temperature of objects by changing hue. He's accidentally invented primitive thermometry, creating visual systems for measuring heat without understanding the scientific principles behind temperature measurement. A wealthy merchant family has hired him to develop heating medicines, pharmaceutical preparations that increase the body's natural heat production through chemical means. His successful formulations contain stimulants, circulation enhancers, and metabolism boosters that actually do warm people from within. His failures contain everything from ground pearls to powdered unicorn horn, neither of which have measurable thermal properties. The alchemist's most ambitious project involves creating artificial, Fire. Chemical reactions that produce heat and light without requiring wood, coal, or other traditional fuel sources. He's experimenting with combinations of materials that ignite spontaneously, burn at controlled rates, and provide sustained heat output. Some of his formulations work well enough to replace traditional fires for heating small spaces. But here's the dangerous innovation. He's developed thermal weapons. Chemical mixtures that can be thrown or projected to create instant heat sources, or, alternatively, to freeze enemies by absorbing heat from their bodies. Medieval chemical warfare where the weapons are designed to manipulate temperature rather than cause direct physical injury. Spoiler alert, the alchemist's most successful inventions are actually rediscoveries of Bowman thermal technology that was lost during the medieval period. His revolutionary heating systems are primitive versions of hypocausts, his chemical fire starters are variations on Greek fire, and his thermal indicators are simplified versions of ancient temperature measurement devices. Medieval innovation through accidental archaeological reconstruction. He's also created what he calls heat multiplication elixirs, liquids that supposedly increase the thermal efficiency of fires when poured on fuel or sprinkled around heating areas. Some contain alcohol or other flammable substances that actually do enhance combustion. Others are expensive coloured water that provides no thermal benefit except the psychological comfort of believing you're taking scientific action against the cold. The Alchemist's laboratory has become a medieval consulting firm where desperate people bring thermal problems and receive customised chemical solutions. He analyses fuel types, prescribes chemical additives, and designs heating systems tailored to specific situations. Medieval technical support where the technical problems are life-threatening, and the support determines who lives through winter. Fringe alchemical fact. Some practitioners claim to have discovered thermal transmutation, processes for converting cold substances into heat sources through chemical manipulation. They're essentially trying to turn ice into fire using medieval chemistry, which obviously doesn't work, but creates spectacular failures that are entertaining to observe from a safe distance. You find yourself in the presence of a merchant who's become an accidental mathematician, forced to develop precise calculations for thermal resource management because imprecise calculations result in death. His ledgers are filled not with profit and loss statements, but with equations that balance fuel consumption against heat generation, food calories burns against thermal output, and survival probability against resource allocation. Medieval operations research where the operations determine mortality rates. The merchant shows you his thermal accounting system, detailed records of heat input and output for every aspect of medieval survival. He's calculated that the BTU value of different fuel types, the thermal efficiency of various heating methods, and the caloric cost of maintaining body temperature under different conditions. His bookkeeping has evolved from financial management to survival engineering, where mathematical errors translate directly into frozen corpses. Listen to him explaining the economics of hypothermia, using charts and graphs that track the relationship between fuel prices, outdoor temperature, and mortality rates. He's identified mathematical tipping points where small changes in resource availability or weather conditions create dramatic changes in survival probability. Medieval statistical analysis where the statistics measure death rates rather than market performance. He demonstrates his most valuable innovation, predictive modelling that forecasts fuel consumption based on weather patterns, family size, house construction, and available resources. His calculations can determine how long specific families will survive under current conditions, when they'll run out of fuel, and what interventions might extend their survival. Medieval actuarial science applied to individual thermal management. Here's your mathematical horror story. The merchant has calculated that maintaining human body temperature in extreme cold requires approximately 3,000 calories per day, while typical medieval diets during winter provide less than 1,500 calories per day. The thermal math doesn't work. People are burning more energy staying warm than they can consume through available food sources. Medieval energy balance equations where the equation doesn't balance and the result is death. A wealthy family has hired him to optimize their thermal resource allocation using mathematical analysis. He's determined the optimal room temperature for survival barely above freezing, the most efficient fuel consumption schedule, minimal heating during day, concentrated heating at night, and the ideal family sleeping arrangements, maximum people per heated space. Medieval efficiency consulting where efficiency is measured in lives saved rather than costs reduced. The merchant's calculations have revealed counterintuitive survival strategies that violate social norms but improve thermal mathematics. It's more efficient to heat one room intensely than to heat multiple rooms moderately. It's better to sleep in groups of strangers than in private family units. It's mathematically optimal to abandon large houses for smaller spaces, regardless of social status or property values. But here's the psychological breakthrough. People who understand the mathematics of their situation show better survival rates than people who don't, even when their actual resources are identical. Mathematical literacy provides psychological control that translates into improved thermal decision-making. Medieval cognitive therapy, where the therapy is arithmetic and the cure is statistical. Understanding. Spoiler alert, the merchant has discovered that medieval people waste approximately 40% of their fuel through inefficient heating practices, burning too much at once, heating unnecessary spaces, and using poor thermal management techniques. His mathematical analysis identifies waste patterns that, when corrected, can extend fuel supplies by weeks or months. Medieval efficiency engineering, where efficiency means survival. He's developed thermal optimization algorithms, step-by-step processes for maximizing heat output from minimal fuel input using mathematical principles applied to medieval technology. These aren't complex calculations, but simple arithmetic procedures that anyone can follow to improve their heating efficiency without requiring additional resources or equipment. The merchant's mathematical models have identified critical resource thresholds below which survival becomes statistically impossible regardless of management efficiency. He can calculate exactly how much fuel, food, and shelter are required for different family sizes under various weather conditions. Medieval minimum viable survival calculations where the viability is literal rather than commercial. Fringe mathematical fact. Some merchants are using thermal mathematics to create survival insurance programs where customers pay premiums during warm months to guarantee fuel delivery during cold months. It's medieval insurance where the risk being insured against is freezing to death and the payout is measured in BTUS rather than currency. You wake up one morning in early March to a sound you'd forgotten existed. Water dripping. Not the sharp crack of ice breaking, not the groan of frozen wood expanding, but the gentle, steady drip of melting snow finding its way through cracks in your roof. The Thames has started to show patches of dark water between the ice sheets, and for the first time in months, you can see your breath indoors without it immediately turning to frost on the walls. But spring doesn't feel like salvation. It feels like emerging from a battle you're not sure you won. Your body has adapted to survival mode so completely that warmth feels alien and dangerous. When you step outside without your full winter armour of rags and furs, you feel vulnerable, exposed, as if the mild air might be a trap designed to lower your guard before winter returns to finish what it started. Listen to the sound of the city slowly remembering how to be alive. Voices in the streets sound rusty from months of conservation, people speaking in whispers to save energy. Children who spent winter huddled indoors are now stumbling around like prisoners released from dungeons, blinking in sunlight that seems impossibly bright after months of grey skies and shuttered windows. The psychological adjustment to spring warmth is more difficult than adapting to winter cold ever was. Your mind has been rewired for scarcity, conservation, and thermal paranoia. Every warm breeze makes you anxious about wasting heat. Every comfortable moment feels like a dangerous luxury that will make you soft and unprepared for the next winter, which your traumatized brain insists is always just around the corner. Here's your post-traumatic spring disorder. People who survive the winter can't stop hoarding fuel even as the weather warms and fires become unnecessary. Homes are stuffed with accumulated wood, coal, and combustible materials that their owners can't bear to use or discard. Medieval preppers whose prepping was life or death necessity rather than paranoid hobby, and who can't transition back to normal consumption patterns. A merchant shows you the psychological scars left by months of thermal calculations. He still measures everything in terms of heat generation and heat loss, unable to think about objects without calculating their BTU value. Food isn't nourishment, it's calories that convert to body heat. Clothing isn't fashion, it's insulation rated for thermal efficiency. His mind has been permanently rewired to process reality through thermal mathematics. You observe families who can't adjust to sleeping separately after months of communal body heat sharing. Children who became accustomed to sleeping with multiple adults now suffer anxiety when placed in individual beds. Adults who shared intimate physical space with strangers for survival can't readjust to normal social boundaries. Medieval intimacy trauma, where the trauma comes from returning to privacy rather than losing it. But here's the cruelest irony. Some people miss the clarity of winter survival. When everything was about not dying, life had simple, clear priorities. Now that survival is no longer the primary concern, people feel lost, directionless, unable to find meaning in activities that aren't directly related to staying alive. Medieval existential crisis, where the crisis comes from having too many choices rather than too few. Spoiler alert. Spring brings a wave of delayed deaths as people who barely survived winter discover that their bodies sustain damage that becomes fatal as the cold stress ends. Frostbite infections spread, malnutrition catches up with people who thought they'd made it through, and immune systems weakened by months of thermal stress fail when challenged by spring diseases. Surviving winter doesn't guarantee surviving the transition to spring. The wealthy who hired thermal services and human heaters during winter now face awkward social readjustments. How do you resume normal employer-servant relationships with people who kept you alive through shared body heat? How do you re-establish social hierarchies that were suspended for thermal democracy? Medieval human resources problems, where the resources were literally human warmth. Churches are conducting special services for winter survivors, but these aren't celebrations. They're trauma counselling sessions disguised as religious ceremonies. Priests helped people process the guilt of surviving when others died, the shame of behaviours they adopted for survival, and the fear that they're permanently changed by their experiences. Medieval therapy, where the therapists are clergy and the therapy is theological. Fringe psychological fact. Some winter survivors develop thermal hypersensitivity, an inability to tolerate normal temperature variations that would have seemed trivial before their cold weather trauma. They experience mild cool weather as threatening, normal room temperature as uncomfortably cold, and they require constant warmth to feel psychologically safe. Medieval PTSD, where the triggering stimulus is temperature rather than violence. You walk through London's streets in late March and the city looks like it's emerging from a war zone. Not from battle damage, but from the systematic cannibalization that survival required. Houses missing doors, shutters, and anything wooden that could be burned. Gardens torn up where people dug for root vegetables. Barrels, carts, furniture and tools, anything combustible reduced to ash and memory during the desperate months of fuel scarcity. The human cost becomes visible as spring reveals what winter concealed. Bodies emerge from snowdrifts, people who died outdoors and were preserved by the cold until the thaw exposes them like grim archaeological discoveries. Some are identified, some are not, and some have been so altered by freezing and thawing that identification becomes impossible. Medieval forensics, where winter itself is the suspect and everyone is a potential victim. Listen to the sound of rebuilding, but not the hopeful construction of new structures, the desperate patching of damaged infrastructure. Roofs that leaked, walls that cracked, foundations that shifted during freeze-thaw cycles. The city's architecture bears scars from winter's assault, and many buildings will need to be partially demolished and reconstructed before they're habitable again. Families are conducting their own reckonings, counting members who survived versus those who didn't, calculating the real cost of their thermal decisions. Some families are intact but traumatized. Others have been reduced to single survivors who now own property and possessions they never expected to inherit. Medieval estate planning accelerated by hypothermia, where inheritance happens through thermal triage rather than natural death. Here's your survivors accounting. People are discovering that many of their winter survival decisions created debts that must be paid in spring. Fuel purchased on credit, food borrowed from neighbours, clothing traded away for heating materials. The economic consequences of not dying now demand payment from people whose resources were depleted by the effort required to stay alive. A wealthy widow shows you the detailed records she kept during winter, not financial accounts, but survival ledgers that track every piece of fuel burned, every calorie consumed, every thermal decision made during the crisis. She's created a complete documentary history of survival that reads like a military campaign fought against physics and weather. Medieval survival narrative where the story is told in degrees and BTUS. The market economy is slowly restarting, but prices remain distorted by winter scarcity. Fuel sellers are still charging premium rates because people can't psychologically adjust to normal pricing after months of thermal desperation. food merchants are struggling to re-establish normal supply chains after winter disrupted transportation, preservation, and distribution systems. Medieval economic recovery, where recovery means returning to pre-disaster pricing rather than post-disaster abundance. But here's the profound social change. The traditional medieval hierarchy can't simply resume normal operations after winter's thermal democracy. Servants who kept masters alive through shared body heat can't pretend to be subservient. Masters who begged fuel merchants for survival can't pretend to be superior. Social relationships have been permanently altered by intimate knowledge of everyone's survival vulnerabilities. Spoiler alert, some people are refusing to return to their pre-winter social roles. Peasants who discovered they could negotiate for better conditions during thermal labour shortages won't accept traditional servitude. Merchants who gained social power through fuel control won't surrender their influence. Women who took on survival leadership roles won't retreat to traditional domestic submission. Winter created permanent social mobility that spring can't reverse. The church is conducting massive funeral services for winter victims, but these ceremonies are complicated by the fact that many bodies were never recovered, were consumed by fires for warmth, or were disposed of in ways that made traditional burial impossible. Medieval grief counselling for losses that can't be properly mourned because the evidence of death was destroyed by the circumstances that caused it. Legal systems are overwhelmed by winter-related disputes. Property claims for abandoned buildings, inheritance battles for people who may or may not be dead, contract disputes for thermal services that couldn't be delivered, and criminal cases for survival behaviours that violated traditional laws. Medieval jurisprudence trying to apply normal legal frameworks to abnormal survival situations. Fringe social fact. Some communities are creating winter memories, permanent monuments, records, and rituals designed to preserve the lessons learned during thermal crisis. They're institutionalizing winter survival knowledge because they understand that this kind of extreme weather will happen again, and when it does, they want to be prepared with more than just hope and improvisation. You find yourself in a London that will never be the same, not because of the physical damage. Buildings can be repaired, infrastructure can be rebuilt, but because the psychological and social changes created by winter survival have become permanent features of medieval urban life. People who lived through the thermal crisis carry knowledge, habits, and perspectives that can't be unlearned simply because the weather improved. The economy has restructured itself around thermal preparedness. New businesses specialise in heat storage, fuel conservation, and survival equipment. Heating engineers have become as essential as blacksmiths. Thermal consultants offer services that didn't exist before winter, taught everyone that heat management is literally life or death skill. Medieval economic diversification driven by survival necessity rather than market opportunity. Listen to the conversations in taverns and markets. They are not about politics, religion, or gossip, but about thermal preparedness for next winter. People compare fuel storage strategies, discuss heating innovations, and share survival techniques with the intensity that was once reserved for military campaigns. Medieval small talk, where the talk is about large-scale survival planning. Social relationships have been permanently recalibrated around thermal competence and survival reliability. Marriage prospects are evaluated based on heating skills and fuel management abilities. Business partnerships prioritize thermal resources and cold weather expertise. Friendships are strengthened or weakened based on how people behave during the crisis. Medieval social networking, where the network is built around thermal survival rather than political or economic advantage. Here's your permanent cultural shift. Medieval London has developed a winter mindset that persists year-round. People think in terms of thermal seasons, plan activities around heating requirements, and make decisions based on cold weather implications. Architecture, urban planning, and infrastructure development now prioritise thermal efficiency over aesthetics, convenience, or traditional design principles. Educational systems have been permanently modified to include thermal literacy as a core curriculum requirement. Children learned fire safety, fuel conservation, heat generation, and survival mathematics alongside reading, writing, and arithmetic. Medieval schools where survival skills are academic requirements rather than optional life experiences. Parents demand thermal education because they understand that their children's lives may depend on understanding thermodynamics. The wealthy have discovered that money can't protect them from physics, leading to fundamental changes in how social status is defined and displayed. Wealth is now measured partly in thermal resources and heating capabilities. Status symbols include sophisticated heating systems, fuel reserves, and thermal technologies rather than just jewellery, clothing, and decorative objects. Medieval materialism where the materials are chosen for survival value rather than display value. But here's the most profound change. People have learned that survival requires community cooperation in ways that transcend individual wealth, social status, or personal preferences. The networks of mutual aid, resource sharing, and communal heating that developed during winter have become permanent social institutions. Medieval socialism born from thermal necessity rather than political ideology. Spoiler alert, the next winter won't catch London as unprepared, but it also won't be as socially transformative. People now know what to expect, how to prepare, and what sacrifices will be required. Winter survival has been institutionalized, systematized, and integrated into normal urban life. Medieval disaster preparedness, where disaster preparedness becomes indistinguishable from regular life. Churches have developed new theological frameworks that incorporate thermal survival into religious doctrine. Salvation includes staying alive through winter. Charity includes fuel sharing, and moral behaviour includes thermal responsibility toward community members. Medieval theology, where God's will is expressed through thermodynamics and religious duty, includes heat management obligations. The legal system has created permanent precedents for thermal emergency law. Property rights now include heat allocation responsibilities, contracts must specify cold weather performance standards, and civil obligations include community survival duties. Medieval jurisprudence, where justice includes thermal justice and legal frameworks accommodate physical necessity rather than just social convention. Fringe cultural evolution. Some people are advocating for permanent lifestyle changes that incorporate winter survival strategies year-round. Communal living arrangements, resource-sharing cooperatives, thermal efficiency standards, and community heating systems as regular features of urban life, rather than emergency adaptations. Medieval environmentalism, where the environment being protected against is winter, rather than general ecological damage. Epilogue, the memory of cold. You sit by your fire on a warm summer evening, months after the great winter ended, but you can't stop thinking about the cold. Not with nostalgia, nobody misses hypothermia, but with the kind of deep cellular memory that changes how you understand everything about being human. The fire in your hearth isn't just warmth anymore, it's a connection to every fire that kept you alive, every piece of fuel that meant the difference between sleeping and dying, every degree of temperature that measured the distance between existence and extinction. London survived, but survival changed London. Walk through the city now and you'll see the alterations everywhere. Houses redesigned around heating efficiency, neighbourhoods organised by fuel-sharing agreements, social relationships recalibrated by thermal cooperation. The medieval world discovered that when basic survival becomes uncertain, everything else, politics, religion, economics, social hierarchy, becomes secondary to the simple physics of staying warm enough to live. The people who lived through that winter carry knowledge that can't be taught through books or lectures. They understand in their bones that comfort is temporary, that civilization is fragile, that the difference between life and death can be measured in degrees of temperature and calculated in British thermal units per hour. Medieval London learned what humans learn in every crisis, that we are more vulnerable and more resourceful than we imagine, often simultaneously. Here's what that winter taught that no other disaster could: that human society is ultimately a thermal cooperation agreement, a collective arrangement for sharing the energy required to keep biological systems running in an environment that's trying to kill them. Everything else, art, philosophy, politics, religion, exists only because people figured out how to stay warm enough to think about things other than thermal management. The children who grew up during that winter will tell stories to their grandchildren about the time London froze, when people slept in piles for warmth, when firewood cost more than gold, when surviving until morning was an achievement worth celebrating. But they'll also pass along practical knowledge: how to build fires that burn efficiently, how to conserve body heat, how to organise communities around shared survival rather than individual comfort. Medieval London's coldest winter became its most educational season. A masterclass in physics, psychology and sociology taught by hypothermia and learned by people who had no choice but to become experts in thermal survival. The city that emerged from that experience was different, not just rebuilt, but rewired for resilience, redesigned for survival, and reorganized around the understanding that warmth is the foundation of everything else humans can accomplish. And on quiet winter nights, when the wind howls and the fire burns low, people who remember that time listen to the cold outside their windows and feel grateful, not just for warmth, but for the knowledge that they survived something that tested the absolute limits of human adaptability. They learned that winter isn't just a season, it's a teacher whose lessons are written in degrees below freezing, and whose final exam is whether you live to see spring. The memory of cold never completely fades. It becomes part of how you understand the world, that comfort is precious because it's temporary, that survival is possible because humans are surprisingly cooperative when cooperation means the difference between life and death, and that the most important technologies aren't the most sophisticated ones, but the ones that keep you alive when everything else fails. Medieval London's winter of 1348 ended, but its lessons became permanent residents of the city's collective memory, passed down through generations of people who understood that knowing how to stay warm isn't just practical knowledge, it's the foundation of civilization itself.